Hello YouTube, this is AndrewTheRed, a book review, Carl Sagan's Cosmos. I have read the book about 2 weeks ago. I finished it, and I'm going to go through the book now with some of the comments I found. Cosmos, it was a TV show in the 1980, I guess starred by Carl Sagan, who was a famous astronomer at the time, and a book was produced, each chapter being an episode. I think it was 13 episode long TV series. The book goes through astronomy in general, but also talks about the beginning of the universe and what they knew at the time in 1980, and also exploring the universe. There's all kinds of great metaphors and great connections with exploring on the Earth and exploring now in space, and how there's some very similar connotations there and similar challenges. It also goes into, later in the book, it talks a bit about evolution, about DNA, and the last few chapters, it starts talking a bit about environmentalism and some of the fears about the nuclear war going on in the Cold War, the fears of a global catastrophe, that we would just nuke each other to death. And there's also some speculations about aliens and what might be out there. You may also know that Carl Sagan was directly involved in, I'm not sure what satellite it was, or I guess it was maybe a probe, you might call it, that was sent out towards the nearest solar system to us. This probe was sent out directly, a direct mission to go to that other solar system. And in this probe was a golden record with directions on it if some alien species were to find it. And on this record is all kinds of information about us, and also music from our world, all over the world, different kinds of music. And I think there's some stories, and there's all kinds of stuff on this record. Really big. It looks like a record. It's a giant, like a record, like old records, gold, made of gold, I guess, because that's what would last the longest. I'm not sure when it's supposed to arrive, but anyways, that was sent out. That was an initiative. It'd be interesting to kind of think about the defense purposes of even sending that out, because it also talks about in the book about whether we would want other species to know we exist, because they might be hostile. But as I'll go through in the book, there's some interesting ideas, and even, you may know, Asimov talked a lot about this as well, who is also a science fiction writer, about whether hostile, like, you think of Star Trek and you think of the Borg and even the Klingons and Romulans, whether hostile species would even make it to space travel. Because if they're so hostile, like I think most people would think it's absurd that people like Klingons would be able to make it into space. I remember even one episode, them saying that scientists in the Klingon world were kind of ridiculed, considered people that were wasting time and just useless and not prestigious, certainly. How could that species have possibly made it to space travel? So there's an argument to be made that only peaceful and intelligent civilizations will even get to space travel. And so we need not worry about being bombarded from space by conquerors, because what could they possibly want from a pre-warp society, right? So that kind of stuff. Anyways, I'll go through the book, and there's some good stuff in here. So this is on page 10. This is in chapter 1. It's already talking about exploring and some connections with early exploration and space exploration. And you could consider at one point, when human civilization was pretty tiny on the world, first civilizations were Samaria and Egypt, so kind of in the Middle Eastern area. Samaria was in Iraq, present-day Iraq, and Egypt was in Egypt, of course, along the Nile River. And exploring for them was just what's out past this hill we've never been to. And travelers and merchants were often the first explorers. They're the ones who would go out on those paths. I guess they'd have to make those paths, but they're the ones who saw the frontiers of the civilization, what's out there, what's beyond what we know. And so at one point, land was a barrier. Some hill or some mountain range even was a barrier. We have no idea what's past that mountain range. So this quote kind of talks about the early exploration. It says here, it was in Alexandria during the 600 years beginning around 300 BC that human beings, in an important sense, began the intellectual adventure that has led us to the shores of space. So there's always the shores. What's the frontier? What's the shores? It's either the next hill, then it became the mountain range. We don't know what's past this mountain range. We can't cross the mountain range. It's too dangerous or whatever. Then it became an actual shore. We can't get across this lake. River you can get across. But if it's too deep, you can't get across this lake. Maybe it's too fast moving and you can't get across it. Then they built boats. Now they can get across lakes and rivers. And then it became the sea. Well, the sea is the shore. We don't know what's past this sea. And then you have bigger boats made, like triremes and things like that, where you could get across bigger seas. And then oceans became the shores. We don't know what's past this ocean. Then you get into the New World era. You have much bigger boats, like caravels and galleons, etc. You can get across oceans, and you find a new world as well as what's happened. And eventually, of course, then there are smaller places to explore, like the Arctic and like the deep seas. Those become frontiers. And then past our planet is a frontier. And past our solar system is a frontier. And past our galaxy is a frontier, that kind of stuff. So there's always these, what's the next shore? What's the next frontier for humanity? Where are we now? Right now, we're at the solar system. Like, we can get to Mars, and we can send probes out, but we can't get past the solar system. And you can even recall when in Star Trek they say the space is the final frontier. That space as a medium, considered land at one point was a frontier. Water was a frontier. Now space is a frontier. And it's the final frontier, at least we think, that's the last medium of travel. But there may be other mediums of travel that we haven't discovered yet. What about a digital universe? What if we created a digital universe? Would that be a frontier? So there's all kinds of progress that you can see, from land to sea, to, I guess, even to air, and then to space. So this is on page 26. Now it's talking about DNA. So it says, if the mutation rate of DNA is too high, we lose the inheritance of 4 billion years of painstaking evolution. If it is too low, new varieties will now not be available to adapt to some future change in the environment. The evolution of life requires a more or less precise balance between mutation and selection. When the balance is achieved, remarkable adaptations occur. So the point of the quote is that there must be some room for both keeping of good changes and also some experimenting going on to even get those good changes. There has to be, for the most sense, a stable genetic structure to all species that are going to survive at all. There must be some, maybe you could say 80% stability, but also some small percent, maybe 20% of room for change in genetics. Then you have the advantages of both keeping good stuff and also some room, some experimenting room. And that will let you also, over a long period of time, we're talking about evolutionary time here, millions of years, that will even let you deal with changes that might happen on the world, such that didn't allow, for example, the dinosaurs to survive, although that might have been too quick a change. But still, some mammals did survive. So that balance is important. And also, we're going to see that in a quote later about the universe itself. And science requires both a stable universe, but also where changes occur. If there's too much stability, there's no point in doing science. If there's too much change, there's no point in doing science. But I'll get to that quote later, but that's something coming up. The next part on page 30 is also I thought it was a good quote about biology and physics. It says here, biology is more like history than it is like physics. You have to know the past to understand the present, and you have to know it in exquisite detail. There is as yet no predictive theory of biology. just as there is not yet a predictive theory of history. The reasons are the same. Both subjects are still too complicated for us. So I thought that was interesting so physics is often very predictive, but biology has to do with the past, just like history does. And biology has a lot of baggage. Where we come from as a species is part of history. But what will that history lead us to is hard to say. I guess what he's saying here is that biology is as speculative as history, unlike physics. Physics is fairly predictive, but biology is more speculative. We don't really know what's going to happen, evolutionary speaking. Now, a lot of people would simply say that, well, we just don't have enough information. And if we had enough information, then we could be predictive about biology, and that's certainly possible. But I thought that was a good quote anyways about the connection between biology and history. So on the next page, on page 32, this is a part of a quote from Kepler, who you may know as a famous astronomer. And also it talks about science in general. So I'll just start with a quote. So he says, "The diversity of the phenomena of nature is so great, and the treasures hidden in the heavens so rich, precisely in order that the human mind shall never be lacking in fresh nourishment." So there's people who are the religious people who say that the universe is created for us, and our minds are created to explore nature. I think it was a quote from Galileo. It said something like, I can't imagine, I don't know if this is Galileo, but it's an old quote. It's something about, I can't imagine that we would be granted the gift of reason and expected to forgo its use. It's a good quote, but it's talking about that. But anyways, this quote from Kepler, I don't think it has religious connotations. It's simply saying that it might be taking this line. It might be saying that it's no wonder that we are so inquisitive and we're interested in how things work, because the universe is just filled with it. It's filled of places to find things out. It's filled of things that work in a certain way, and we're very curious about finding that out. In a sense that it's no wonder that we like to play and to explore, because this world is a playground. There's just so many things to find out. But anyways, I'll continue with, this is now Carl Sagan. "If we lived on a planet where nothing ever changed, there would be little to do. There would be nothing to figure out. There would be no impetus for science. If we lived in an unpredictable world where things change in random or very complex ways, we would not be able to figure things out. Again, there would be no such thing as science. But we live in an in-between universe where things change, but according to patterns, rules, or as we call them, laws of nature." About DNA being some kind of in-between thing, both stability and change, the universe also has to have that in-betweenness. It's got to have some laws and stability, but also some changes, some things that we have to figure out. And what we have to figure out has got to be things that we can actually contemplate and discover. They can't be so complex that the human brain is just can't figure it out. Now, the question is whether the universe necessarily needs to be that way. Is the universe necessarily, like design there's religious connotations to the word design, which I don't mean to use, but is the world so constituted that the human brain can explain it and understand it all? But that need not be the case. However, we've also evolved to understand the world. So, but still, that doesn't necessitate that there are things out there that are going to be understandable by us. At the same time, though, what evidence does one have to suggest that there are things out there that we'll never be able to explain? There's no evidence for that, and therefore it's purely speculative. Like on what basis would one assert that there could be things out there that the human mind could never understand. On what basis? Just because, well, the universe doesn't have to follow our minds. Maybe the universe, there's certain things about the universe that would be so complex. But anyways, that would be very difficult to make an argument for. You just merely would have to say that the universe is as it is, and there may be things out there that the human mind would never be able to figure out. But there's very little grounding for that. It would just have to be a very blanket statement to say that there are very simple things and very complex things. And the human mind, I guess the other thing you'd have to say is that the human mind does have limitations. As of yet, though, there is none. We have not discovered limitations. So it's very speculative, but I understand the other side that says that, well, the universe is as it is, and it may be that there are just very complex things out there. But consider also not just our human minds, but the kind of technology that we build. It may be the case that our human minds are able to invent and discover technologies that greatly multiply and accelerate our intelligence to then understand everything in the world. So, and then in any case, at what point could you even say that you have checked that box and we've found everything in the world? So it's very speculative. But anyways, there are certainly people who say just out of nowhere that, well, there must be things that are just too complex and the human mind will never be able to grasp. But I think that's more, that sounds more like misanthropy to me. This next quote on page 34 is talking more about what are the origins of astronomy. So it says, as ages pass, people learn from their ancestors. The more accurately you knew the position and movements of the sun and moon and stars, the more reliably you could predict when to hunt, when to sow and reap, when to gather the tribes. As precision of measurement improved, records had to be kept, so astronomy encouraged observation and mathematics and the development of writing. So I thought that was very interesting. You've got these balls in the sky, this white ball that comes up at night, and this a ball of fire during the day, and it seems like gods to, of course, primitive tribes. And so they start to study these things, and this leads to inquiry, leads to science, it leads to precise record keeping, it leads to calendars, it leads to measurements of days and nights and keeping track of those things. It would then, I guess, eventually, with a big enough city, it would lead to people dedicated to the task and not just hunters, not just star seers. So all of this is kind of the origin of science and astronomy in particular. This next point, so he's getting into now Kepler and Copernicus and their fights or their encounters with religion and religious speculation about what this world must be. Of course, all the religions, most of the monotheist religions preach that this world is the center of the universe, that we are God's most perfect creation, and everything it's very egocentric, right? Like everything is about us as the center of the universe and all that kind of stuff. And everything, all the planets must be in circles, and there was a magic number of 7 or something like that, how many heavenly bodies are supposed to be 7, and all that stuff. And Kepler was trying to work this stuff out. Apparently Copernicus had an insanely complicated orbital structure because he would watch the planets and he would see what they were doing, and he was trying to figure all this out with all these circles to map them out, and it wasn't working very well. Especially Mars was really screwing with everything, because Mars actually, because we're faster in our orbit, Mars actually at one point goes backwards in its orbit, so it's going around, and then to us it looks like it's doing this, and then it goes back again, and that just screwed with the early astronomers like Copernicus and all that. But anyways, Kepler eventually had to abandon a circular orbit because a circle was considered perfect. And the Earth was considered a perfect sphere, and all the other heavenly bodies and the sun and all that were supposed to be perfect spheres. And of course, we're all supposed to be traveling in perfect circles as orbits. But eventually Kepler had to abandon that. So this is a little bit of a story about why that happened. It's interesting. This is on page 47.